Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Francesca with the Educator's Room, and today we're bringing an installment with one of our writers, Ruben Brosbe. Did I say it correctly?
Yep, that's right, Brosbe.
Brosbe. And we're going to talk about his article that he wrote entitled "White Educators, Do You Recognize State Trooper in Encina?" Is Encina? Yeah, I think his name is Encina. Before we start, Ruben, can you give us a little bit of your background and your background in the classroom or in education, period?
Sure. Well, I'm going into my 7th year teaching. I started teaching in 2007 as a New York City Teaching Fellow, which is a alternate certification program. And I taught for 4 years, and then I took a break from teaching. I actually went to grad school at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I was getting a degree in education policy and management. And I thought that I wanted to go into policy, but I realized like right away in my program that I didn't want to be separated from the on-the-ground work, the classroom work. So then I spent a year managing an extended learning time program called Citizen Schools, and I did that in the Bronx, which is where I did my first 4 years of teaching. And after 1 year of that, I was ready to go back to teaching, and I've been doing that for the last 2 years, and it's been a really great experience to come back to the classroom after a couple years away, to have some new learning under my belt, and to have the perspective of like a coach of teachers, and to realize how hard that work is and how much work I have to do on my own teaching, to feel really confident to help other teachers teach.
Oh, wow. What do you currently teach?
I teach 3rd grade general education at a public school in Hamilton Heights, which is a little north of Harlem and right below Washington Heights in Manhattan.
Okay. So one of the things, and I know everybody has been watching the news, and we've been following pretty closely with the article, with the news article about Sandra Bland being pulled over, ultimately arrested for not using a turn signal. Her arrest, the video came out, and a couple of days later, I think it was 2 days later maybe, she was found dead in her cell. So one of the things that I wanted to first talk about, what, as a white educator, what kind of, I'm assuming you work in a majority minority school.
That's right.
What did you first think when you saw this video, or how did you even hear about it, or how did you even come to want to write about this?
Well, I saw the video just because, fortunately or unfortunately, that's just kind of the time that we're living in, where it seems like every day we're getting a new story, a new video of some example of police violence. So, excuse me, I came across the video on social media, and I watched it, and it gave me this pit in my stomach watching this human being, Sandra Bland, be completely humiliated and disrespected. And then at the same time, I just felt this kind of flash of recognition of, teachers in my life. And I think if I'm 100% honest, there have been times in my life where I have been that teacher. So it's not meant to be just accusatory to other people. It's just the fact that there are times when our emotions get the better of us, and we may get, in a student's face, or even if we're respectful of students' space, we may escalate a situation to protect our own authority rather than walking away. And I say that, I think that's especially true.
Okay.
That is the soundtrack of New York City.
Yeah.
I say that as a younger teacher. I think that these kinds of power struggles are especially prevalent for novice teachers. But I wrote the piece specifically about my experience and calling out the experience of white educators, because it's not just about being a new teacher, and it's not just about being a teacher. race is a part of our dynamics in the classroom. And as a person that is passionate about social justice, that sees equity and equality as a fight that's important to me inside the classroom and outside the classroom, I have to see my own role in it. And I think one other part of that is just recognizing that teachers are also, you know, agents of the state, so to speak. We have a completely different relationship with kids than police officers do with citizens, but like it or not, we are, public school teachers are, you know, public servants. We are agents of the state, so that comes with it a power and authority and responsibility that also affects the dynamics with our kids that we teach. And so I wanted to write that piece to kind of bring my own struggles kind of into the air and ask for other white educators to kind of struggle with that too, because I think it's uncomfortable, but I don't think we're gonna make any progress if we shy away from discomfort.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point when you talked about, because one of the things when I read the article and I thought it was a really good article, and I felt like you didn't call people on the carpet, but I felt like you brought up some really good points that nobody tells you in getting ready to be a teacher, especially a teacher in a minority school district with kids who sometimes, and just like any kid, they sometimes don't follow the rules. And you don't know necessarily how, not you, but teachers, younger teachers don't know how to respond and how to do it in a way that doesn't humiliate children sometimes. So I'm gonna ask you this, because this was the #1 thing when I read the article. As a Black woman, I read it and I said, oh my God, this is so true. I wish people would read this and take this into account. But when I looked on our Facebook page, the first thing that people said was, why are you calling out white educators? Why did you use white people? Why does this say Black people? Why does this say everybody? So one of the things I want you to speak about is, I know you said, you know, for the younger teachers, but what is it about teaching for non-minorities, teaching in an urban school district? Is race, it seems like race, I don't even know how to put this into words, but it's so inflammatory. I mean, people could not get past the use of you saying white people. Like, it was
Right.
just such a big deal. So, you know, with that being said, and that's just on Facebook, how do you think educators in the classroom, do you think they even deal with the fact that I'm different than the kids that I'm teaching? Like, speak about that, because that was such a big deal. Like, there were so many people who didn't even read the article and who just said, oh, it's about white people, I don't want to read it, this is accusatory, you're categorizing all of us, and without even reading it. So, like, what was it about that word? You would have thought that you would have called them every name under the sun.
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. So if it's all right, I'm gonna have to tackle it like a few different ways.
It's totally fine.
I think that for starters, like, race absolutely plays a part in my role as a teacher, as a white teacher teaching students of color. And I think back to the work of Lisa Delpit, who's a writer and a professor who I really respect, who writes a lot on this idea of, you know, differences in culture. She has a book, Other People's Children, that is kind of one text that I always think back to, that really speaks to the fact that there are different languages that we speak. She even has another book called The Skin We Speak, I think. So this is really central to her work, this idea that if I grew up in Northern California, which I did, as a middle-class, privileged white male, my life experience is drastically different than the experience of a Black or Latino child growing up in the Bronx. And not just our experiences, but our upbringings and the language that my parents used to discipline me is different than the language of a Dominican or Puerto Rican or African American child. And so we have to be cognizant of that. We have to recognize that there is a difference between us, and to recognize that difference isn't to be racist. Recognizing race is not racist in of itself. Prejudice, discrimination on the basis of race is racism, but saying I am white, you are black is actually, to me, the first step of celebrating diversity and really appreciating one another as full human beings. So I guess that would be the first thing I'd want to mention, is that there is a lot of research by people much smarter than me that speaks to the fact that there are differences, cultural and otherwise, on the basis of our backgrounds, and that we need to be respectful of that. So if I, as a teacher, say to one of my students, would you please have a seat? That student may not genuinely understand it fully, as opposed to if I say, like, have a seat. And to say it in a way that's more direct can be disrespectful depending on the tone. But if the tone is said firmly, but with like respect and love in my heart, it's actually, in my experience, going to be more successful and possibly more respectful of that student's home culture. And obviously, not every Black student or every Dominican student has the exact same home life and upbringing, but there is research and many lived experiences that shows that that is the case. So that's kind of my first point.
And let me stop you right there, because you brought up an important point about recognizing like your differences. As a teacher, and I had to recognize my difference growing up I grew up poor, but I grew up in a situation where I was a very small percentage. I was one of the only Black children in my school. I lived in an all-Black side of town. However, I went to school with white kids. So what I was used to, or my assumptions going into, because my first year teaching, I taught in Memphis City schools. So even the way I was raised, and it wasn't perfect, I had to stop myself in some of the things that I would ask my kids to do. And even the tone, recognizing that, yes, I'm a Black female, but I might have grew up a little bit different than some of the kids that I teach. Neither good nor bad, it's just different. So when Absolutely. I tell them, when I say things like you said, please sit down, that struck a chord with me, because my girls, I can remember back teaching at 22, and I'll tell them, didn't I tell you to sit down? For a young man, for a lot of my boys, oh, that's like mom talking. Yes, ma'am, Miss Lane, I'll sit down. To my girls, it was almost like an invitation for an argument. Mm-hmm. Didn't I tell you to sit down? So I had to quickly say, okay, let me go back. Hey, Susie, take a second. Can you take a seat for me, please? I had to change my tone. And I think that's a very important thing, like you said, about differences, recognizing our cultures are different, recognizing and changing some of the things. I just had to interject that, because that, even for me, I had to realize that. And when I work with new teachers, I have to tell them that, what you say, at our school, we have a lot of African kids, and a lot of them are Muslim. And so a lot of our kids that we've found, especially with our boys, with the female teachers, it's a cultural difference for them to have to take orders necessarily from a woman. For some of them, it's very hard for them. So when a female teacher tells them something and they don't immediately comply, it's not that they're trying to be disrespectful, but in their minds, they're trying to figure out, it's just different. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. That's a really good point.
And as teachers, we're constantly trying to be the best that we can and to be the most respectful and effective with our communication. So to say we're not going to acknowledge this whole piece of the interaction and relationship is, in my opinion, like shooting yourself in the foot, because how are you going to be the best teacher you can be if you're saying, I'm not going to take into account this powerful component of the relationship that I have?
Yeah.
And I think to like another experience that I had in my first year, there was a veteran teacher, and she was an African American woman, and I would sometimes hear her talking in the halls with a very firm and direct tone. And as a first year teacher, I was like sometimes like horrified. Like, how can she talk to the kids that way? Meanwhile, my kids were a mess. You know, I could not manage my classroom. And I think I've grown to appreciate, one, how much I really misinterpreted the way she was speaking to her kids. And two, that, well, to explain that a little bit more, like, you can be strict, you can even be a little harsh, but you can have love underlying that and warmth and saying, you know, I care for you, and that's why we're not going to fool around and look like a bunch of knuckleheads in the hallway, because we're better than that. So I think that that experience has informed a lot of how I think about the way I interact with kids now too. Is like, you know, this teacher, she had her classroom under control, but also they were incredibly successful students. They learned what they need to learn. And I think the fact that they had a shared background and she spoke to them in a way that a lot of them was, you know, culturally relevant, was probably a big piece of that. But to your story also, there's class differences that make a big difference. And there's also, for our students that come from different countries, there's cultural differences that are more than just the color of our skin, for sure. I think to your question, though, about why was white such an inflammatory word, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think it's, yeah, I don't know whether to laugh or cry about it, to be honest, but I think that the idea that calling out white teachers or calling out whiteness, whatever you want to call it, is racist, first of all, shows me that we, as a teaching community, don't fully agree on the definition of racism, because that doesn't match my understanding of that at all. And generally, this idea of like reverse racism or racism against white people shows a misunderstanding of the history of this country and the present of this country, because generally racism has to have like power attached to it. And we look around us and we know that the Constitution and the laws and the majority of our lawmakers currently are white men. So I'm generally not worried about racism against white people, because first and foremost, I don't think it exists. But I think the bigger issue of why people reacted so strongly to me saying white educators is because we don't talk about whiteness very often. And I think also that white people, we walk around with the privilege of being individuals. So who are you calling white educators? Like, you can't just generalize about a whole group of people. That would be inappropriate. But have you like noticed that we generalize about groups of people all the time? They just aren't white people. So the experience of like reacting to like, how dare you lump me in with all these people just because of the color of my skin, that's a reaction to the newness of that experience, because white people have that privilege of, you walk around day to day and you're not responsible for your whole people. You get to be an individual. You get to be a teacher, not a white teacher. But on the flip side, I don't have to explain to you, Black people, women, Latinos are constantly judged not just on the merits of their individual character, but they're seen as part of a whole group, and a group that's othered. But white people get to live in the world and work in the world as teachers without having to be seen as part of a group. And so I think for people, when I said white educators, for a lot of people that was a new and jarring experience, because that's part of the privilege of whiteness, is to be an individual that's never thought of as part of a group.
Okay. And that's a really good point. I didn't think of it in that. Because a lot of what I think about race is from my own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when you talk about, you know, calling out white people or lumping them all into one and having the joy of being an individual, that's something that our students don't necessarily, you know, get to enjoy. Because if you're a minority, then you're lumped into, you know, whatever class, race, you're lumped into that. You know, all Muslim kids, all Black kids, all Hispanic kids, all Asian kids. So that leads me to the second point. You know, we talked about leaving the classroom for a while, coming back. What do you think, you know, because we have so many, in this day in education, we have so many schools that are turning into charter schools, or so many schools turning into, you know, and they're bringing on this new group of teachers who are young, who are energetic. Many times they're not minorities. What will be some of the things that you say? Because really to me, your article was about power. It was about how, you know, when you're in a classroom, you have a lot of power, and to use that power constructively instead of reacting in the heat of the moment. What would be something that you think that teacher preparatory programs can do? Because you want kids who live in South Memphis to see people of different races and that look different from them, because it broadens their perspective. But what would you do for those teachers that are having to go to those schools and interact with those students, and they're kind of just left there and they have no idea except what they see on the news, on TV, maybe a little bit 3-week training, or maybe a month training if they're lucky? What would be some of the things that you say to do to prepare teachers for that power struggle that's going to happen?
Well, I think that first and foremost, race and racism specifically have to be addressed in teacher prep programs, because I think that's a big component of how we walk into these situations unprepared. And I think that goes beyond teaching people how to read a book by a Black author in their literature class. Like, I think that we have classes that are designed to be like culturally relevant literacy, or you know, multicultural ELA, whatever the class might be called, but they don't quite go beyond the surface of that. And I think they don't quite challenge us as white teachers to really do the hard thinking of, how does my experience affect me as a teacher? How does my experience as a white, maybe middle class teacher, how does that affect who I am as a teacher? And how is that gonna bring a lens to the work that I do? And I think that teacher prep programs really need to push us all to do deeper thinking on that. I took classes in I got a master's while I was teaching that, you know, included the word multicultural, but I don't think they really challenged me to think deeply about my own racial identity as a white person. And I think that, you know, I think that work like Lisa Delpitt's work is a great place to start for people to think about, you know, the language, not just the words that we use, but there's unspoken language that we use as well. And I think that needs to be thought about. Like, and then first year teachers are going to mess up. I think, you know, I don't think there's any way, at least in our current system, to design a teacher prep program that's gonna turn out successful teachers from day one. But I think new teachers need to be as reflective about the racial dynamics of their classroom as they are about, you know, the classroom management that's, you know, they don't think about in terms of race. So, you know, I think first year teachers are always thinking about, well, should I have these students sitting next to each other, or should I try a different way of transitioning from one lesson to the other? And they work really hard to do that kind of reflection, and they need help to also reflect on the issues of race and gender and all the different kinds of identities that play out in their classroom. And I seek out help with that too. I don't want to, for a second, speak like I'm coming from a place where I'm done with that work. If anything, I feel like I'm at the very beginning of that work, but it takes constant effort of reading and thinking. So I guess one last suggestion I would say is just do a lot of reading, and it doesn't have to be textbooks, but do reading of fiction or reading of people on social media whose experiences are very different from your own. And that can be a very powerful way to shift your thinking and realize, you know, what we consider the norm, or what you might consider the norm, is far from normal from a lot of people in our country.
I think those are really good suggestions. In our school district, I had a principal, he decided to take all of his teachers at the beginning of the year on a bus ride through the neighborhood that they were going to teach through. Because, you know, a lot of times, I don't know how they do this in New York, but we get so many teachers here in Atlanta that are from other parts of the country. And so
Right.
they might be from New York, from California, from Florida, from, you know, just Texas, everywhere. And so he put us all on a bus and we went through the neighborhood. And it felt very weird to me, almost like a zoo. Almost we were in a zoo and we were watching, and I wasn't comfortable with it, but I had to take myself out of the equation, in that a lot of teachers don't know where their kids come from. And not only physical where they come from, but just the mental, you know, just the whole persona of where they live. At the school that I used to teach at, he took us on the school bus ride, and we were right next to some projects. And it was very interesting to see the younger teachers kind of see, you know, when you ask a child, and not to say that to ask a child to type a paper is wrong, it's not. But, you know, when you ask a child to have 5 pages typed, and you go to their neighborhood and there's not even a functioning library, it kind of makes you say, oh, well, you know, sometimes they just don't have the resources, and I need to be better cognizant of that when I assign something. So I need to make sure that I open up the computer lab, or I explain this, you know, for those things. So I think you're exactly right with the reading, social media. And I think social media has made it a little bit easier, because with Facebook, with Twitter, you know, with Instagram, you're exposed to, if you want to be, you're exposed to so much more from people who might not look like you, or her ideas are different from you. Right. So it kind of, if you're an inquisitive person, you know, you'll want to read it all, and you'll say, oh, I didn't know that. Well, how does this affect me in my classroom? So I think social media is changing the game a bit, hopefully, with how we view ourselves and our differences and how to get over our differences. Do you think, you teach in New York, so New York is very diverse. I mean, you have a lot of different cultures, things going on. How do you think, when you say, because in New York, and I learned this many, many years ago, you know, when you go to some parts of the country, somebody might look like they're a certain ethnicity, but they're not.
Right.
How do you approach race, social justice with your students? Like, what do you do in your classroom day one, week one, month one? What do you do? Because it's obviously that you are different than your kids, but how do you introduce that, and how do you make that a topic that's okay to talk about, and it's not something that's going to hinder y'all's relationship?
Well, I think that I try to bring it up as quickly as possible, but not force it. But I have noticed in the last few years, which are actually for me the first few years that I've tried to really be explicit about these kinds of conversations, that my students come to me not quite ready for that conversation, because race has become such this taboo. A lot of teachers even mentioned on the Facebook page that the way that we're going to overcome racism is by not talking about race, or not seeing it, which good luck. I have a very different opinion on that. There's a famous video by this teacher, Jane Elliott, who did an experiment on races in the classroom, and she discriminated on the case of blue eyes and brown eyes.
And I saw
This white woman wanted to get up and get out of the room, and she kind of said, "You can't do that. You know, you can't just walk away from this conversation." But another part of the video that I really wanted to talk about was she makes this point that she brings this gentleman to the middle of the room, and she says, "You wouldn't ignore the fact that he's a man. You wouldn't ignore the fact that he's tall. Like, you wouldn't ignore these other aspects of his identity." And so our skin color, our race is a part of who we are. And I think that just in the way that I want to learn my students' favorite TV shows, and I want to learn their hobbies and their favorite snacks early on in the classroom, or in the school year, I mean, I also set it up early on that I want to know about their culture. And that's a part of who we are. I teach at a school. New York City generally is very segregated. So even though as a city it's diverse, its school system is very segregated. But I teach at a school that is abnormally diverse. I have kids from Dominican Republic, Japan, West Africa, you know, all different cultural backgrounds. Kids who are immigrants, kids who are not, you know, kids who have a lot of different, I have a lot of multiracial students. So it's really important to me to set the stage right away that I want to know who you are. And part of who you are is the language you speak at home. And part of who you are is, you know, where your family comes from. And a part of that process also is doing home visits, which I think goes back to your point about the tour that you went on, which I think is interesting that you said it felt almost like a visit to the zoo. I think that strikes me. Like, driving through your kid's neighborhood in a bus is going to be a very different experience from walking on the ground. And if you're lucky, they'll welcome you into your home, into their home. And that has changed the dynamic for me with every family that I'm lucky enough to visit. You know, we have a very different relationship from then on, because they see that I really want to get to know them, and they get the chance to kind of welcome me, you know, whereas when they come to the classroom, I'm the host. So that gives me a certain level of power and authority also, especially being in a school building. But if I'm on their turf, you know, then, you know, they get to kind of feel a little bit more of that sense of, you know, I'm welcoming you, and what can I do for you? And I think it also helps to break down some of those stereotypes also. You know, I've been in the homes of some of my Black students who live in these very nice townhouses that are, you know, nicer than anything I'll afford to live in New York City. And that's partly because they've been in the neighborhood for a long time. But I think it's also important to, you know, break down those stereotypes of like, oh, well, because you're a Black student who goes to school in Harlem, you're probably poor and you live in the projects. No, there's obviously an array of diversity economically within the Black community in New York City and beyond. But yeah, I think home visits are a really powerful tool for me to make that connection with families, and also students kind of get that implicit message like, oh yeah, Mr. Ruben kind of wants to know who I am, and that goes beyond just who I am in the classroom.
I think that's a good point. You know, a couple of years ago, probably about 6 years ago, I did my first home visit, and I taught for about 14 years, and I taught high school. We went to the students, we broke up into clusters, and we visited our 9th grade students' homes. And you're right, it changed the dynamic because you're sitting in their living room, you're seeing, you know, where they sleep at night, where they live at, the family dynamic. You're seeing all of this, and it helps you in class to identify with that student and to even just have that connection. One of my kids, oh God, I can't think of his name, that's so bad. But we went to visit him, and he had older parents. He came from a really good home. He had his parents were much, much older though, in their 50s or 60s, and he was the youngest. And the dad was kind of like Fred Sanford, like he would just say anything, but he was so funny. And he just told us on the visit, he said, you know, I want my son to go to college, and I want you guys to help him go to college. And, you know, the student was a really good student anyway. And just this year, he got accepted into UCLA. So he's actually leaving Atlanta. Right, he's leaving Atlanta, and he's going to California. But what I was trying to say was his dad got sick during his sophomore year. His dad had lung cancer, and he was very, very sick. And us establishing that relationship at the beginning of his 9th grade year and ongoing, because we would call his father and he would say, oh, you're the ones who visited us. You know, what's going on? He was much more receptive. But when he got sick, it was much easier for that student to come to us and say, hey, my dad's really sick. I feel like I'm going to lose it. You know, it just established that relationship so much more. And the kids knew, hey, they'll go to your house, so we kind of need to act right. You know, it was that type of, you know, oh my God, the kids were so shocked to see us, even though we told them, hey, we're coming to your house this weekend. We're going to do visits in the neighborhood. And when we got there, the kids were kind of like, oh, they're serious. Oh, okay. So, you know, it was just it really opened my eyes to not only my kids, where they live, their parents, their brothers and sisters. It just started a whole new conversation that had nothing to do with school.
Definitely. I think also just a couple of quick, easy things that I do. You asked about starting the conversation on race, and I don't know if I fully answered that, so I just want to share a couple quick examples. One thing is having kids do self-portraits, and that opens up a conversation about skin color, depending on what kids are willing to do, because I have noticed some of my Black students they'll draw a portrait of themselves, but they leave their skin blank. So just starting to open up that conversation. Oh, like, you know, why did you do that? Or maybe not even questioning them on that, but saying like, you know, how can we all find the colors that we need to make sure that we show who we are? So I think self-portraits are kind of a way to come at that conversation that isn't necessarily direct, but can have some really powerful conversations. And I mean, for me, teaching 3rd grade, read alouds are always kind of the go-to conversation starter. And there are a lot of great books that I think start that conversation. And one book that I usually start the year with is called As Good as Anybody. And that's a story about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and a rabbi named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And even though I think it's really important that kids know that racism and civil rights are a conversation for today as well, I think the 1960s civil rights movement is a very comfortable place for kids to start talking about that, because a lot of them have a lot of prior knowledge about that. Almost all of them, even in 3rd grade, know who Dr. King was, and they know who Rosa Parks was. So that's a kind of easy place to start that conversation. And even there, like, you might see where kids are comfortable or not comfortable. The book I was talking about, mentioning that the rabbi is white, you might see some kids like squirm a little bit, or, you know, mentioning the skin color, race of Dr. King. I noticed what kids were comfortable with. So that can be kind of a way to assess and also start that conversation.
I love what you're saying. I wish my child could be in your class, because I sit and think about, you know, as kids, like when you talk about a self-portrait, sometimes how we identify ourselves or how we view ourselves is so different than how the world sees us. So I think, you know, validating that, hey, you're different, but you're important and you matter, you know, I think that's a really strong step in not only identifying who you are, you know, racial, but also identifying who you are as a person and being proud of who you are as a person. Do you, when you look at the article and, you know, you talked about it a little bit, what would be, somebody said in one of the comments, they said, you know, they were in agreement, and they said, you know, I see this happening at my school, but I don't know how to address it. And I don't know, you know, to address it, I might cause some teachers to be mad at me. So when you see teachers who use their power in a way that isn't productive, I think that's a better way to say, isn't productive, what would be some of the things that you would say that you could, some tools that you could give other teachers, principals, administrators, so that everybody starts the year off and, these are some things that we're going to implement behavior-wise and, for teachers to help them disciplining students, especially if the teacher is the only minority in the room, because it gets very tricky. It gets very tricky when, if I'm a middle-aged white woman and I have a classroom full of minority students and I feel uncomfortable disciplining them. And that's honestly like how some people feel. I feel uncomfortable. Yeah. I don't know what to say and I don't want to get my words misconstrued. So what would you say to do?
Wow, that's a tough question. I think that as teachers, that's kind of an awkward position sometimes for us to have to address a colleague, because at the end of the day, like, a lot, especially if you're in a school where you might be struggling with your administration supporting you, like, you're kind of in the same boat. You have to have each other's backs. But that isn't to say, like, I think silence is not an option if you really see that the kids are at risk, not necessarily like physically, but if you see that a teacher is really struggling, you have to reach out in some way. I do think that first I would say, before you worry about the person down the hall, I work on myself first. Like, I need to look in the mirror and figure out what I'm doing. I think it's sometimes when I write an article like this or someone reads an article that I wrote, they might feel comfortable saying like, oh, well, I get it. Like, oh yeah, like, time to pat myself on the back. But I think step one is saying, I'm still working on this. What is the work that I have to do? I think if you are going to try and help a colleague out, ideally you have to address it as a whole school, kind of like you mentioned. Like, it is going to be much more effective and powerful if it's coming from the school administration and ideally the parent association as well. And everyone can kind of sit down at the table and have that conversation. And I think especially bringing that parent voice would be really valuable, because they're going to know better than anyone, how to have that conversation with their kids. And if it's older kids, if it's high school, I can imagine bringing in some student leaders for that conversation as well. But as far as if it comes down to like a one-on-one conversation, because we do help each other out. If we need to help someone out with a new strategy for math or for grading homework, we always find a way to do that. So if it comes down to cultural competence, I would say that you want to try and address it in a way that's non-judgmental, that's just kind of saying, my door is open. Like, I noticed that you were getting really frustrated with so-and-so the other day. I have a few tricks that I use in my classroom. You want to, have lunch together and talk about it. Sometimes just recommending a book or an article, maybe saying something like, I'm having the same problem. I found this great article that mentions like 5 strategies for what to do. I think that the biggest challenge for me is just figuring out how you're going to overcome that person's ego. Especially as you notice with the article, if race is a factor, there's a lot of defensiveness to overcome. So trying to find a way to open that conversation while kind of leaving a lot of outs for that person to not feel like they're getting a finger pointed at them.
I think that's really important, because ego does play a huge part in how you discipline children and how you speak to them and how you admit your own shortcomings. I wanted to ask you, we're going to wrap up in just a second, but some of the things that I think teachers get confused about is that, we're human and we make mistakes. And, it's in my opinion, as an instructional coach, as a teacher, and now working at the district level, is that when you own your mistakes or your shortcomings, the kids are a lot more forgiving. They're a lot more forgiving of you, and they say, hey, you're just like me. So, one of the things if an educator reads this article and they say, oh my gosh, this is me. This is how I talk to kids. This is what I do. This is what I have done. What are some of the things, especially going into the new year? You know, of course, you talked about meeting the parents and going to the homes, doing home visits. But what are some, and also reading several books, but what are some of the things in the moment that you can kind of tell teachers just from your own personal experience of, you know, stepping back and saying, let me have this conversation at a later time. Let me do this. What are some things in the moment? Because, you know, once you get in that moment, when you have to discipline a child and, you know, it's supposed to be corrective discipline, but it becomes, you know, punitive. What are some things you can do in the moment?
I think one thing that I'm honestly still working on, but that I know is incredibly powerful, is to keep these conversations as private as possible. I think something that I do that works well, because we use the responsive classroom approach at my school, is that usually before this conversation even happens, I'll ask the kid to take a break. And I set up that break area at the beginning of the year so that it's not punitive or judgmental, and that every kid knows that they're going to use that space at one point or another. But if I'm feeling myself even approaching that struggle, I'll often say, you know, take a break and we'll talk later. And that can be good for the kid to cool down, but 9 times out of 10, I'm the one who's really benefiting from the space, because now they're gonna take, you know, 3 to 5 minutes to get themselves focused, and I can turn my attention back to what I really want to be doing, which is either teaching or conferencing, doing small group, whatever the case may be. So if your school uses it, or if your school enables you to use it, I think the responsive classroom approach for elementary school is a really great structure for avoiding power struggles, because it really helps you to set up a classroom that's based on community and mutual respect and kids taking responsibility for their actions. If you're not doing responsive classroom, though, you can still find a way to say, you know, we're going to talk about this. It's not going to be right now, but we're going to check in about this, and give yourself that out, because it's rarely going to end well if you find yourself in a back and forth where you're trying to have the last word.
Yeah, because I mean, kids are good. I don't care how young they are. They understand. They want the last word.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever gotten it.
Yeah, you know, even as a mother, like, you know, and these are my own kids, they will go back and forth attempting to get the last word. You know, so you article, and, you know, we talked about this for a while on the site about bringing a social justice, and we've written about, you know, some topics about race and justice and class and those type of things, but we're really looking to expand that work, because I think it's so important, especially in urban education today, where schools turnover is so high. You're bringing new teachers in, and we're living in an age where I really honestly believe we're seeing a revolution, and we don't really understand the capacity of things that are happening. So, you know, the campaign of Black Lives Matter, you know, just all these things that are happening. What's next? Like, do you shy away from articles like this, or does this help you help yourself and help people that you know? So, you know, what's next for you?
I think for me, like, these kinds of conversations are what excite me most about the fact that I'm still in the classroom, because I really think that, for starters, the social justice work that I've done with the kids has been incredibly rewarding for me, but I've seen my students the most engaged that I've ever seen when we've done this kind of work. And we've engaged in conversations about how to create a more fair community in our classroom and in the broader world. So I definitely want to keep pushing myself to have these conversations. It's a conversation that I'm in the beginning of having at my school. And, you know, once I kind of raised it in a couple conversations, I realized how thirsty my coworkers were to have the same conversation. And I think it's also interesting, given the climate that we are in as teachers, where so many teachers feel under attack. I actually feel like there's an element of self-interest to it as well, that if we really commit ourselves to changing the way power works, I think that teachers will end up with a lot more respect and authority and independence in the long run. Because I think actually one of the reasons that teachers are finding our power eroded right now is because it's a predominantly female profession, and I think that has to be addressed as well. So I think that even though some people have a very visceral negative reaction to the idea that social justice is a part of the teaching work, it's actually in the long run probably a little bit of a selfish interest as well. Like, if we find a way to improve our whole society and find a way for marginalized communities to get the respect and love that they deserve, then that's going to help teachers as much as anybody.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point, because, I think it does teaching an injustice when we say social justice is not for teachers. That's not what we teach. We teach subjects. Yeah. I think we handicap our kids, and I think we just handicap them, because our kids have to know the type of world they live in. And even our kids who are street smart, who are interacting every day in this world, they still need to know how to move. I always tell my kids, and they're high school kids, you have to know how to move in certain situations, and you have to know, what came before you, what's going to come after you, and how to handle yourself, and just how to speak up about certain things. And the first part of speaking up is not being afraid and to voice your concerns. So as teachers, we always say our profession's under attack. We don't have this, we don't have that. Well, social justice is a great way. It really segues into, the state of teaching right now, because with all these changes, most of these changes that you see where schools are being wiped out and schools are being, closed, are schools that are happening in minority communities.
Right.
So all of these things, poverty, race, class, social justice, all these things are intersecting, and we have to talk about it, because if we don't, it's like we're gonna stick our heads in the sand and just act like none of it's connected. So,
and I think so many teachers talk about wanting to develop their kids as citizens, and for me, like, citizenship has to be tied to social justice. Obviously, maybe I'm speaking from a progressive, liberal mindset with that, but I think citizenship isn't just about knowing the three branches of government and, the Constitution. It's about knowing the ways in which you are responsible for taking part in your community. And I think just the other point that you made about teaching kids how to move through the world, most kids, even third graders, already recognize the way power works around them, but they don't know the names for it. So it's almost like if you're in a room and you smell something funny, but you don't know, oh, like, that's gas. Like, I need to call, like, the utilities, or I need to call 911. Like, the kids smell something, they know that something's up, but they don't know exactly what the problem is. They might not know the names for it or the structures that are at play. So if we can help them with that, then they then have tools to try and help themselves and help others, I think.
Yeah. And I think you're right, because they definitely understand power, and they definitely understand who has it and who doesn't.
Right.
They want to get power, what they need to do. When the whole Black Lives Matter campaign came out, and there were people on social media, I remember hearing someone say, I teach subjects, I don't want to talk about that in my class. Mm-hmm. Working in an urban school with kids who are engaged in everything under the sun, teaching them that they matter. Also, police brutality, gang violence, shootings, like all of that intersected, because it's what they were living in, and they had opinions. And it was almost, I was proud of them for being able to make a connection of what they were seeing in the news and the implications it had for them as students living in an urban city, and watching some of the same things happen to their friends or their loved ones, and just knowing that I can speak out. And that goes to show, also I tell my kids, speaking out starts with not only you speaking out about police brutality or, other social justice, but about what's happening in your community. And we have this big talk about, what does it mean to snitch? And how is this tied into Black Lives Matter? How does this tie into social justice? And, it's just a very interesting dynamic because everything intersects. And the kids really had no clue. They just saw police brutality as this. This is what it is. Yes, it's that, but let's look at all the other things that come into play with all these other things happening around us. And how can you fight against, the things that you know that aren't right? So I think you're right. Do you have anything else you wanted to say about the article? Or, I know this week you wrote about leaders in the classroom. Is there anything else you want to talk about, or any closing thoughts that you had for our viewers?
I think just the one connection I see between this week's article about leading your classroom and last week's article is just ultimately recognizing how powerful we are, even if we maybe don't work in a school where we get to choose our own curriculum or textbooks. Like, that is definitely a threat to a teacher's power over their teaching. But at the end of the day, we are still responsible for so much. And I think that the first and foremost responsibility is to acknowledge our students fully and to love our students fully for all of who they are. And that ends, or that begins rather, with ending a colorblind approach to teaching and ending an approach to teaching that says we're not going to acknowledge difference. We may have gotten disconnected.